Hello, this is Outlaw Bookseller Stephen E. Andrews. Welcome to my channel again. This is the latest video in my series entitled Reading List Rock, which is where I look at the interdisciplinary, intersectional aspects of rock music and how they are influenced by literature and culture as a whole. So far, I've been looking at the work of the Stranglers, a little bit of David Bowie, but I feel the time has come to look at one of my favourite bands, and I'll be doing quite a few videos about them for some time. And as you can probably tell by the t-shirt, it's time to talk about Hawkwind. And I've been a Hawkwind fan theoretically since Silver Machine came out, because when Silver Machine hit the charts, I was not quite 10 years old, and we had a record player. We didn't just bought it, but I didn't really hear a lot of rock music because I didn't live in a street with other kids. I lived on a mountaintop in Wales, so I'd go home from school and I had no mates around. But one of my best friends at the time had a copy of Silver Machine and played it to me, and I borrowed it from him and I played it again and again and again because I was obsessed with the sound of the synthesizer at the beginning, and I liked science fiction at that stage, and I could tell it had a sort of SF vibe. So that was my first experience of Hawkwind, and then I didn't really re-experience them until the early 80s when a friend of mine said, "Do you remember Hawkwind?" and played his copy of the compilation Master of the Universe at me. And I never looked back. Within a matter of weeks, I had all the albums and I started going to the gigs, and I became a huge fan, and I've been a huge fan ever since. So this is, as I say, the first of a number of Hawkwind videos, and I'm going to talk today about one of our favourite records, Quark, Strangeness and Charm, which of course we all know and love. And this is the sort of double grey vinyl issue from a few years ago. Oh, it's not grey, it's clear. I thought that one was grey. So she's got multiple copies, of course, as you know, most of us collectors have. And just to sort of put this into context a bit more, I'm doing this because I started writing reviews of Hawkwind online probably about 10, 11 years ago, and on the websites where I bought reissued CDs and what have you. And these went down rather well. So this led me into a correspondence with a chap called Joe Banks, who wrote this wonderful book, Hawkwind, Days of the Underground, which has been out for a year now. And I hope as a Hawkwind fan you have it, because it's magnificent. I mean, this is a great book for anybody who likes real rock and roll writing, because it's not just another biography which slavishly goes through the routine of, you know, they did this album, it was great, they did this tour, it was great, they had this hit single, so-and-so got kicked out. It's a lot more to it than that. And when Joe and I were corresponding, he approached me after reading some of my reviews. I replied to him that what Hawkwind needed was a cultural approach to look at their wider significance, because to me they were more than just a rock and roll band. They encompassed a lot of other things in culture, particularly science fiction. And as I'm a bit of a science fiction expert, I thought that I'd talk about Hawkwind in relation to literature, and I decided to start with Quark because I think it's one of the finest science fiction albums ever made. So without further ado, I'm going to go through it track by track and talk about the album and the tracks and let you know what I think. Well, of course, it begins with Spirit of the Age, which started as a Calvert poem, and in different verses it covers different science fiction tropes and views of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and how alienation seems to be one of the key things in the future, as depicted in SF, dystopian futures. And of course, to begin with, the first verse is about the time dilation effect of going into space, traveling at intense speeds, which means that your time slows down, but time on Earth moves at the regular rate. And the narrator is reflecting on his young girlfriend who's left at home, who wasn't allowed to come on the voyage. And he has an android replica, as you know, which is playing up. And he talks about how this is a sex robot substitute. And this is in the 70s. I mean, books about this kind of thing are common now. They've been written about then, and probably the most recent notable book is a book called Holy Machine by Chris Beckett, which I cover in one of my other videos, a video about my sort of top 5 contemporary British SF writers. So that's worth having a look at. It also covers cloning in the song. Cloning has been a subject covered in science fiction for a very, very long time, going right the way back. I think one of the earliest examples I can think of is in John Wyndham's Plan for Chaos, which came out in the late 40s. But it sort of goes further than that. I mean, not too long ago, a Nobel Prize winning writer, Kazuo Ishiguro, wrote this wonderful, wonderful book, Never Let Me Go, which is about cloning. And scientifically, it's a bit of a mess, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and I do urge you to read it. But, you know, it also crept down into the sort of annals of pulp SF. There's a book called Cloning by David Shear, quite an obscure British book from the 70s. Probably the most famous book about cloning, which I discussed with Joe, and I think he mentions it in his book, is a book called Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang by Kate Wilhelm. And I think something that Calvert nails in the lyrics of Spirit of the Age is the idea that clones, of course, would be genetically identical. And we all know of the uncanny closeness of twins because, of course, they share the same genetic material. They are one being split into two, as true identical twins for always the same sex. And this reminds me of David Cronenberg's film Scanners, in which he says that telepathy is not mind reading, it is the joining of two nervous systems across space. That's very often how twins seem to be and feel. That, you know, biology is destiny, and it's not a very fashionable view because it seems to be a determinist view. But that is something which is sort of quite clear in Calvert's take on it, where the clones are alienated by their lack of individual identity. So I think Spirit of the Age opens up with a classic sort of dystopian background, which is common to the all SF. And I think that sets the sort of tone for the album, really. So we'll move on and have a look at the next track. I must say, I think that the opening side of Quark, Strangeness and Charm is probably the finest individual side of science fiction rock music that I've ever come across, because it is irredeemably SF from start to finish. There's no ambiguity about that. And the second track, which is the majestic Damnation Alley, which retells in fantastic diluted form this story from Roger Zelazny's novel, Damnation Alley, which was made into a film at the same time as Hawkwind were recording the song. And it's a terrible film, you know, don't bother. But Calvert nailed the key elements of the book and transformed them into this wonderful, wonderful rock and roll song. And something that struck me listening to the song some time ago was how it's rather like a Chuck Berry parody. As Calvert goes through the names of different cities in the US and how they've been irradiated, flattened, destroyed, and by the nuclear apocalypse which precedes the events of Damnation Alley. It's rather like Chuck Berry's classic song Promised Land, but a young man making his way across the states from the sort of east coast to California to the Promised Land. And Hell Tanner, the protagonist of Damnation Alley, is doing a similar thing, albeit to try and find an anti-plague virus. So it's interesting that there's not just a cover of Zelazny's book, which is one of his minor books, but it's a great fun book. But it's also a Chuck Berry parody, which I thought was really, really clever. So, you know, that litany of irradiated post-nuclear American cities. I mean, the thing about America is you can write a song based around the romanticism of the names of the cities, which you couldn't do in the UK. It would come across as a joke instead. So that's an absolutely wonderful piece of work. And you know, Zelazny, if you're not familiar with him, he was one of the key figures of American New Wave science fiction. Hawkwind adapted 3 of his novels into songs, this Lord of Light, and later on Jack of Shadows. And he was quite a major figure. He died quite young. He collaborated once with Philip K. Dick and with various other science fiction writers. And he was quite unique. His best work is probably his short stories. But this is a great fun book, so do seek it out. Great post-apocalyptic novel, nice and short and sharp. I think it's out of print at the moment, but it's easy enough to find second-hand. So that's Zelazny. So moving on from Damnation Alley, it fades into a rather beautiful sort of drone-based number, Fable of a Failed Race, which I think is just beautiful. And it's really refers to the seeding of other planets with human life in terms of colonization. And this has been a theme in SF for a long time. I mean, one of the key books about seeding is a book called The Seedling Stars by James Blish, which is put together out of several stories where the seeds of people are sent to different planets, and they evolve in different ways to meet the needs of those planets, and that's become a big theme in SF, and that's a very sort of interesting thing. And this idea is called pantropy, and pantropy props up every now and again. And one of my favourite books of pantropy, if I can find it, and I do have a pile of things here, is a book by a writer called Gary Kilworth called The Night of Kadar, which is about the seeding of a planet from a spaceship where there are embryos in suspension. And what's interesting about this is that they are all people from the Middle East, they're Muslims. And it's a really beautiful book, and something goes wrong, they end up on this desert planet, but things are not quite right. And Gary Kilworth was a signaller in the army, or the RAF, and he spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I think he was in Aden for a long time, and in the Pacific, and he put that in his early books. This is from the early 70s. This is his second novel. Again, it's out of print, it's quite easy to find, but it's really, really beautiful and fantastic, and it has the kind of plangent, elegiac quality that Fable of a Failed Race has, which has magnificent lyrics, and Calvert nails this more unusual science fiction trope so well, I think, in that. And interestingly, because this has a Islamic background, and I will say in the book, on the epigraph page, Kilworth says, "Nothing is intended towards the religion of Islam in this book except respect." And that was in the 70s. And it's wonderful stuff, you know. It really does tie in, funnily enough, with a track later on in the album, which we all really know and revere, which is Hassani-i-Sabbah, sometimes called Assassins of Allah in later live versions, but Hassani-i-Sabbah is the correct title, of course. So it does sort of tie in with that a bit. So there's a tangential link through that book, which is something probably that Calvert may well have read at the time, because he was a very well-read chap, of course. So Pantropy also came out recently in a novella by Becky Chambers called To Be Taught If Fortunate, which in my view, she's really popular, but it's not a very good book, nothing happens in it, but Pantropy comes up in that. And, you know, compared to something like Fable of a Failed Race, it's a complete squib, and it does show how a lot of the contemporary SF audience have really lost their way and you know, are revering quite minor works. So I'd say don't bother with that one. This is the import box set of Quark, Strangeness and Charm, which I think came out in the 90s, and there were a couple of these from an American label. There's a really nice one of Astounding Sounds Amazing Music, and I got that one as well. Astounding is one of my favourite albums alongside Quark, and it's quite an interesting little artifact, I have to say. So that's worth watching out for if you're a collector. And side 2 of Quark, of course, begins with the title track, Quark, Strangeness and Charm. Quark, Strangeness and Charm, of course, focuses on the romantic issues that astronomers and physicists have. How they, you know, they're nerds, they can't get on with girls and what have you. And it's very clever. There's all sorts of jokes about Einstein and Galileo's telescope, which of course is an innuendo. And, you know, it's a really, really funny track. And I always really, really liked it. And there's that amazing live version, of course, on the Business Trip Live, which is superb. Possibly my favourite version, even though it's Brock rather than Calvert singing. But I do love that lovely folksy timbre of Dave's voice. So back in 2001, I went to a gig in Swindon Arts Centre to see one of my favourite musicians do his first ever solo acoustic performance. And that was J.J. Burnell of the Stranglers. And I was sitting in the front row, and I've been a Stranglers fan for a long time, since the 70s. And to my amazement that night, JJ talked about doing a cover of a song, and he covered live Quark, Strangeness and Charm, did a great little version of it. He said ever since that he wanted the Stranglers to do it, and they've never got around to doing it. But he's talked about how much he loves this song. So it's one example there of how, you know, a punk rocker, one of many punk rockers, were influenced by Hawkwind. And it's a shame really that they've never got around to do it for the death of Dave Greenfield, because that would have been wonderful. But you know, a really, really funny song. And of course, quarks are the stuff of matter, and they come in 4 flavours: up, down, strangeness and charm. And you know, good cover versions are hard to come by, but I'm sure the Stranglers hopefully maybe one day will do, and sadly it won't be the same without Greenfield and Cornwall. But you know, hopefully they will do a proper cover version of that and take it to a new audience. Now, Bob Calvert, being a literary man with aspirations beyond poetry and rock and roll, because he could see that things were changing, wanted to write full-length fiction as well. And he produced this novel, Hype, which came out to coincide with his album of the same name. They formed a conceptual pair. And this is a true UK world first edition, paperback original, published by NEL. And I bought this as a remainder, probably about 6 months after it came out, and because it was commercially quite unsuccessful, and it now changes hands in this condition for up to around £80–90. It has been reissued, and I think you can get it, but this is an original, as I say. And in this, he covers the career of a sort of hyped new wave star, kind of Elvis Costello, Joe Jackson, sort of Steve Swindles type figure. Because Steve Swindles, to me, that's rather like the sort of thing that Costello, Jackson, and to a degree Tom Robinson were doing. Not to disrespect Steve, I mean, I really, really like his work. I think it's fantastic. And of course, he was asked at one point by Brock to be the lead singer of Hawkwind when Calvert left. That would have been really interesting. But so this came out, and in this, this is going to be a spoiler, so if you haven't read it, you might want to turn this down. The rock star Tom Mahler is assassinated because of a song he writes called Black September, and it's about the petrodollar crisis in the Middle East. So there's a kind of tie-in with Hassani-i-Sabbah, which obviously is about jihad, fundamentalism. And of course, Hassani-i-Sabbah was a real person, a mystic, master of the assassins. The assassins were a cult who smoked hashish and lived in caves in the Middle East, and they were sort of fundamentalist, as I understand. I read a book by Henry Miller once called Time of the Assassins, a very long time ago, about this. And Hassani-i-Sabbah is a figure revered by the countercultural writer William S. Burroughs. Now, William Burroughs you've probably heard of. He wrote Junkie and Naked Lunch, probably the most famous countercultural writer there was. So he was the sort of person that loads of people in the 60s and 70s read naturally as breathing air. And Hassani-i-Sabbah is one of the characters in this novel, The Western Lands, which is the last volume of Burroughs' sort of second trilogy. And it's very interesting stuff about time travel, reincarnation, what have you. And Burroughs was often fond of quoting Hassani-i-Sabbah's statement, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." And David Cronenberg used this in the film Naked Lunch as well, based on Burroughs' book, loosely. And that is what informs Hassani-i-Sabbah and that wonderful Middle Eastern flourishing violin of Simon House. So there is a sort of tie there. So it's not a science fiction thing, even though this is a science fiction novel and there are science fiction elements. Burroughs saw SF as fundamental to understanding contemporary literature. So Hassani-i-Sabbah, even though it dates back before Quark, because it was co-written with Paul Rudolph, of course, and re-recorded for the album, the original version is sort of kind of forgotten, then that's a sort of tie-in as well. So at every stage we can see these tie-ins with science fiction, even where they're not obvious. And I mean, Hawkwind had referred to Burroughs before, tangentially. You know a song from Space Ritual called the Orgone Accumulator, which is the first, I think it's the first song that we really hear Calvert sing. Instead of like speaking poetry, he's actually singing it. And the Orgone Accumulator derives from a scene in Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, where he and Neil Cassidy, they have different names in the book. They go to see their friend Old Bull Lee, which is Bill Lee, William Burroughs, because William Burroughs used the pseudonym Bill Lee for his first book, Junkie. And he often appears in his novels under the names Lee or Seward. And when they get to his house in the country, old bully William Burroughs is sitting in an Orgone Accumulator in his garden. Now, if you don't know what an Orgone Accumulator is, I would say do look it up. It was a device invented by a rogue scientist called Wilhelm Reich, and he believed that these particles in the atmosphere called orgones, which were life-giving, that could prevent you from getting cancer and what have you. And an Orgone Accumulator was like a layer of metal, a layer of wood, and then another layer of metal in a box form, and you'd sit in it and you'd accumulate these particles. And it was a Superman creator, as the song said. So Hawkwind through Cabot had already covered that, and that's, for me, is one of the most exciting moments in their canon, where they refer to the classic Beat Generation novel in the Orgone Accumulator. So, you know, there's a connection to Burroughs there as well. Moving on, we then have the instrumental, The Forge of Vulcan. Well, of course, this is a classical reference to Hephaestus, Vulcan, from classical mythology. But, you know, I think there's another reference there as well, which is to, if I can find it, to another science fiction novel, possibly, which the guys in the band would probably have read. This is Philip K. Dick's Vulcan's Hammer, which is an early novel from the early 60s. Not highly rated. I really like it personally. I think it's great fun. And I've had this, God, for years and years, since the late 70s. And it's about a computer that is autonomous, self-serving, sentient, and it sort of gets rid of war and poverty. So it's a bit like Savior Machine by David Bowie from, you know, The Man Who Sold the World. And then, you know, it sort of ends up sending up these small flying AIs attacking people. So that's Vulcan's Hammer. So maybe, you know, that was being referenced slightly there as well. Though it's more likely it was just a classical reference. So Cabot being that sort of classical kind of guy. There's the song which is the one which is arguably least associated with literature, culture, science fiction, what have you, and that's Days of the Underground. And of course it talks about Ladbroke Grove and Notting Hill, where Hawkwind formed. It's looking back nostalgically, just 4 or 5 years at the sort of freak culture there was there. But of course, one of the most important cultural denizens of that area was Michael Moorcock, who of course collaborated with Hawkwind a lot on albums like Roaring the Edge of Time and the latest sort of Chronicle of the Black Sword album. And also living in Ladbroke Grove, or growing up there, according to Moorcock mythology, was his counterculture anti-hero, Jerry Cornelius, who starred in about 8 novels, numerous short stories by Moorcock and other hands. And if you're not familiar with Jerry, Jerry is a kind of parody of James Bond and Austin Powers, those sort of people, but he's much cooler. He's very psychedelic. He wears a black car coat. He changes his skin colour regularly. He changes sex occasionally. He carries a needle gun. And he is a former Jesuit, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics. He's a rock star in a band called the Deep Fix. And he's this sort of strange mythical figure. And he represents the balance between law and chaos in the universe. And he steps from one side to the other, and he represents our uncertain political times amongst many other things. And this is a collection called The Lives and Times of Jerry Cornelius. There's been a couple of versions of this, because Moorcock is still writing Cornelius stories. And they're very strange, and they're very reflective of current events very often. But they're great. And Jerry grows up in Ladbroke Grove, and that area, as Moorcock did. And Moorcock, of course, that's how he met Hawkwind, because he lived in that area then. And Moorcock was, of course, the editor of New Worlds magazine, which was the key locus of the literary movement of new wave science fiction in England, in the UK, actually in the world, because there was an American new wave, which was slightly different. The British one was even more hardcore, more literary, more avant-garde, more experimental. And it was very, very much part of the counterculture and the underground. So, you know, if you buy magazines like International Times, Friends, what have you, New Worlds was very, very much that way as well. It was a countercultural magazine, and certain American writers actually moved to Britain to work with Moorcock and to contribute to New Worlds. So they weren't just sending stories over. Some of them, like Norman Spinrad, John Sladek, Tom Dish for a while, actually moved over and worked very closely with Moorcock on the magazine. So Moorcock was part of that. So he was part of the Days of the Underground. And science fiction was part of the counterculture then in a way that it had never been before, and it's never been since. It was a definitive part of the sort of hippie, new age, Aquarian sort of ban the bomb situationist sort of thing. It was a really, really big part of it. And if you want to read a great novel about those days and slightly later, there's a book called Johnny Come Home by Jake Arnott, which is a fantastic novel. I really recommend that. I'm going to cover Jake in another video another time. But if you could pick up some of Jerry's adventures, particularly the first novel, The Final Program, which is one of my favourite books. That's really, really great. My copy's buried behind loads of others, so I couldn't find it to get out for this video. So do watch that. And of course, there was a film of The Final Program, which was directed and designed by Robert Fruest, who worked on the later colour episodes of The Avengers. And Final Program is available in the UK on DVD. It's not very good. There is an American Blu-ray that's much better from Fox Lorber. I think it's Fox Lorber. So check that out. And Hawkwind are in it very, very briefly in the background. You barely see them. It's a shame. Sadly, there's no outtakes on the video showing more of them. So Days the Underground does refer to that as well. So it is part of that whole thing. And you know, the album sort of draws then to a close really with the Iron Dream. And the Iron Dream's an interesting one because it's just a short instrumental and is credited to Simon King, the drummer. Now, of course, Simon probably did write it, but it could also be one of those things, who knows, where they felt the guy's needs some credit, some writing credit, get the guy some money, get his name in the brackets. But either way, it's a great piece. And of course, the Iron Dream is quite well known now that it refers to this book by Norman Spinrad, The Iron Dream. And The Iron Dream is a really fascinating alternative history novel. And I didn't put it in my top 5 alternate history novels because I knew I was going to talk about it in this video, though it really is my bonus track from that, as it were. And one of the common themes in the alternative history subgenre is the idea of the Axis powers winning World War II. This is cleverer and subtler. In this, Hitler goes from being a minor figure involved in a putsch in the 1920s in Germany, and he decides to abandon politics and he moves to America, where he becomes a pulp science fiction writer. So when you open the book, you get the title page that says The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad. Then you turn it over again and you get another title page, Lord of the Swastika, a science fiction novel by Adolf Hitler. And inside this is a raging, parodic, phallic-obsessed parody of fascism. And Spinrad wrote this to sort of really uncover the sort of fascist symbolism, which is often in sword and sorcery books, and also to satirize figures on the right wing of traditional science fiction, because Spinrad was part of the new wave, like Robert Heinlein, who people like Moorcock, M. John Harrison, you know, they all really hated Robert Heinlein, who was really, really popular in the 60s and the 70s, of course. And the theory is that his book Strange in a Strange Land was part of Manson's inspiration, so that didn't, you know, go down too well. So this is really clever and really funny. So set in this alternate world where Hitler's a science fiction writer, and you read his novel, which is full of mutants who are obviously metaphors for Jews and what have you, and there's a master race. So it's kind of a sort of big sort of pastiche parody joke, really. So that's what's referred to in that. But if you listen to The Iron Dream, what fascinates me about it is that musically, it's rather similar to Mars, Bringer of War, from The Planet Suite by Gustav Holst. Now, The Planet Suite is, you know, one of the more accessible and most famous pieces of classical music that we know. Everybody knows Mars when they hear it, even if they don't know that's what it is. And it was used in the film of The Man Who Fell to Earth, featuring David Bowie, directed by Nick Roeg, based on a novel by Walter Tevis, brilliant writer who wrote a lot of science fiction when he wasn't drunk. He also wrote Queen's Gambit, which is on Netflix recently. Terrible version, but amazing book about chess. And Bowie had a connection with Holst and Mars, the Bringer of War, going back to his early days. One of his early bands used to play a few bars of Mars, Bringer of All Life, and it's very, very like The Iron Dream. And The Iron Dream is obviously very consciously like Mars because it's a book about war and it's about fascism and the Iron Heel. So it's very, very much that sort of thing. So Bowie used to do it. And the interesting thing was, of course, was that Bowie was inspired to use it because as a kid, and this would have been the same for the guys in Hawkwind in the early 50s, they would have seen Quatermass on the TV. The Quatermass series, the Quatermass Experiment, 1953, Quatermass 2, these are script books later on, they weren't novels, and Quatermass in the Pit from I think 1959. There is a DVD of all these, though most of the episodes of the first series are missing, were really popular, and the theme music used for the Quatermass Experiment was actually Mars, Bringer of War. And Bowie said that's why his early band, I think it was the Lower Third, one of his early bands used to do it live. So, and the Iron Dream is really, really like Mars, Bringer of War. I've got a bit of a sort of tone deaf ear when it comes to identifying actual chords and notes. Chords I can do sometimes, notes not. But they sound very, very similar. And of course they were made into films and TV series. And by the end of the 70s, I think it was 79, the fourth Quatermass story, which is just called Quatermass, sometimes Quatermass 4, occasionally the Quatermass Conclusion, was shown on TV. And this was written, I think actually in the late 60s, and it was turned down because it featured a post-apocalyptic Britain where society's broken down. And there are lots of planet people walking around, and they're basically hippies. They're wandering around and they go from standing stones to standing stones. And it was felt to be sort of like too reflective, the times are slightly behind them. But of course, it kind of prefigured the whole Battle of the Beanfield and the Krusty movement and the resurgence of those things in the 80s, which of course Hawkwind was involved with. So from the Iron Dream, you go to David Bowie, to Gustav Holst, to Quatermass. So there's all those associations in there. And, you know, that's kind of like the beauty of Hawkwind. There's all sorts of cultural things going on there, as Joe and I discussed. And so when you listen to Quark's Strangeness Charm again, you'll have more of a background maybe on what influenced it, possibly what the guys maybe were looking at, what they brought to the table. There were probably other influences as well, I'm sure, and how it's cross-influenced things since. It's a very influential record, and its significance and its importance just grows and grows. So I hope you enjoy that. And I say, if you've not actually read Joe's book, do, because it's absolutely fantastic. If you enjoyed the channel today, there'll be a lot more Reading List Rock, a lot more Hawkwind, and please subscribe, like and comment. And at some point I'll take you through some more oddities in my Hawkwind collection. The serious collectors out there will have them all, but you never know. There might be one or two little gems. So this is Stephen Lee Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller, signing out. And remember, shoals of dead fish float on the lakes, but Uncle Sam's on Mars.